Hey guys, welcome to the next installment in our video lecture series, and today we're going to take a look at the Articles of Confederation. We are chugging along here through our Revolutionary Unit, Period 3, and today with topic 3.7, again, the Articles of Confederation, as you can see here in the background. We're really going to try to focus on a few things with this and talking about kind of the powers of the Articles of Confederation, kind of what was made up in it as far as the government and how it operated with the legislative branch, and also a really big theme here, what I want you to think about as we go through here, is why the Articles of Confederation is the way that it is and why it's structured the way that it is. Really, as a direct result of a fear of tyranny. Imagine, put yourself in the shoes of a colonist at this time, or as a founding father at this time. You're Thomas Jefferson, you're James Madison, you are John Adams. You have this fear of creating a system that you're trying to break away from. You don't want to allow a system where you have a king put in place. Remember, you're fighting against a king. You don't want to create a new one in the United States. So, as far as the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, we're going to see that it really is a direct result of a fear of having a tyrant or a monarch here in the United States. So again, just to kind of put us in a time frame, in 1776 we declared independence on July 4th, and now we are in need of a new government. So we're kind of fast tracking a little bit to 1777 when the Articles is going to be ratified. And the people that are in Philadelphia know that they want a democratic or a republican system of government. They want a system set in place that it will restrict the power of a tyrant, that will not allow for a strong national government. They want stronger states governments. Because remember, a lot of these states, they're not used to organizing together. They typically have their own governments within their states, whether they're state legislatures or their city councils and so forth. So they're not used to having a national or a federal government. And many of the founding fathers, the people who are the architects here of the government, they are historians themselves. They've been studying the Enlightenment. They read the works of John Locke and Montesquieu. They study history. They studied the ancient Greeks, the Romans. And they don't really want a direct democracy in the way that the Athenians had. They believe that that creates mob rule where you really have the 51% take away the rights of the 49%. They would rather have a system set in place by the Roman Senate, where you have more of a legislature that is a republic, not a democracy, so you indirectly are electing people to make decisions for you. So you still have a key component of voting, however, it is not just a straight direct democracy where everybody's voting on issues or where it's more about the majority rule. And when you have independence being declared, now instead of having 13 colonies, you have 13 independent states. And you can see here the boundaries and how they basically declared themselves all the way out to the Mississippi River. So they've gone past the Appalachian Mountains, and a lot of these have been extended. And each of these states are going to have a series of things they have to create. They all create a legislature. They all create a governor to be the executive branch leader within their own states. And most of them have a Bill of Rights guaranteed. And now that they have done this, now they're looking to create a federal government to kind of hold everything together. And this is going to be what the Oracles Confederation is. It's the Americans' first attempt at a national government, and it will last from 1777 to 1789. And when this confederation comes together, really the way that it's structured, what a confederation is more of a club. It's a loosely connected set of government that has very weak federal powers. The actual federal branch of the government could not do very much. It really was more about each individual state having more power. Think of it kind of like the European Union in Europe today, where you have this European Union. It's kind of a collection, a club of all Europe, Western and some Eastern European countries coming together to kind of create governance. But each European Union member still has their own autonomy within themselves, and they all govern themselves independently. So, like Germany, it governs itself differently than France and Belgium and so forth. So that's kind of what this confederation is where you still have each state having more power than the government combined, the federal government combined, I should say. So Virginia governs itself differently than North Carolina or Maryland or Pennsylvania, and the states have more power, more autonomy than the actual government does, the federal government does on a national level. And they're going to meet in New York City, and it's going to be set up in a certain way where each state would have between 2 to 7 representatives. However, you only each get one vote. So Rhode Island has one vote, New York has one vote, Virginia has one vote in the legislative branch. And with each state having one vote, in order to pass a new law, you had to have 9 out of the 13 states agree. That's a pretty solid majority. You had to have a 70% majority in order to pass certain laws, and then to amend any sort of laws, you had to have every state legislature um, agree to it. So you had to have a unanimous decision. That's hard enough with 13. Imagine trying to get 50 states to all agree on one thing. It'd be almost impossible. And it was even impossible for all 13 states because you have states with different self-interests. Delaware has completely different interests than North Carolina, and Virginia has different interests than Massachusetts. So each of these states really have their own agendas in here because they all work independently. Really, all the federal government did would be to make laws to settle disputes among states, whether they be over territory or trade or so forth, and even mostly trade they didn't get involved in. They could negotiate treaties with other countries. They would handle Indian affairs as far as anything kind of we talk about like with the Bacon's Rebellion, where you have colonists, or I'm sorry, where you have citizens who are now being threatened by Native American populations, and they have the ability to oversee a military. However, they don't have the ability to tax, so therefore it makes it almost impossible to do any of these things, and everything else is left up to the states. So you have the states really with more power than the federal government. And again, like I said, the biggest reason why it's so weak at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that it's because there's a fear. And there's a fear that the British or the government, style of government with a monarchy, is going to take over in the United States. And you had some people like Alexander Hamilton who actually liked the system of government more so in England and wanted to kind of bring that system to the United States. They did not want to be ruled by the king. But you had this fear of creating a tyrant. And that's why you did not have the ability to tax. And the states had more power. You can see here what some of the powers were. Like they controlled their own militias. Okay? They were able to veto anything that they wanted to. So again, it only took one state to say no, that you could not make something, you could not amend the process. They could bar trade. If they wanted to say, we don't want to trade with England, they could do that. If Virginia decided they didn't want to trade with Maryland, they could do that. So the states, again, they have more power as a whole than the federal government. So let's fast forward a little bit to 1783, and we're going to see that. Remember, we talked about with the Treaty of the American Revolution, Treaty of Versailles, that now England's completely out. They're completely out of the continental United States. They're still in Canada. They still have land in North America. However, everything from the Mississippi River eastward is controlled by the United States. And these states who really had not moved past the Appalachian Mountains now have all this land to try to figure out what to do with. And you can see how some states are trying to lay claims to it. You can see New York just taking their boundaries and moving them westward. Same thing with Pennsylvania. Same thing with Virginia here. North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. They're taking their boundaries and extending them all the way out to the Mississippi River. But there's overlap in some places. Like, what do you do with this territory that Pennsylvania wants to control, but also so does Virginia? And same thing here with Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. So this is one of the few things here we're going to take a look at is that Articles of Confederation did a really good job of is trying to decide how we're going to break up all this new land here in the Northwest Passage and then also in the Southeast as well. So the first step was for these states, they had to basically give up the land. They had to concede it to the national government. And this is exactly what they did. And you can see here which states ceded the lands, and which makes it kind of interesting because like, you would wonder, well, why does Massachusetts think that they own this land? Why does Connecticut? Why does New York think they own all this land? You can see what we talked about earlier, that states were overlapping each other. Like New York is claiming all of this for New York, all the way down to present-day Alabama, Mississippi. Well, we think of New York, we don't think of that area. So you had a lot of disputes over this land. You can see Virginia here is giving up this land that will eventually become Kentucky and so forth, and Tennessee here with North Carolina. So all this land is given back to the federal government. So beginning in 1785 and then working throughout the 1780s, the federal government is going to create a series of land ordinances that is going to try to distribute and trying to set up what to do with these lands here in the West. And the first thing, the land ordinance of 1785 is going to break it down into townships and farms and basically to create little areas that are no longer just big blockades of land. And by selling these lands, the national government would try to create revenue. So they would just sell these lands off to private ownership, so people who wanted to move out westward. And we'll see this will happen in multiple times throughout history. As the United States keeps gaining more and more land, they will sell it off in order to turn profit to its citizens. And one of the reasons for this, they don't have the power to tax. So the federal government, remember, governments mostly make their money through their tariffs, taxation, and so forth. They don't create anything. Well, if you don't have the ability to tax, there goes your entire way to make money. So this is one of the ways the government is able to create funding for the federal government is through by selling this land. And so you can see here as an example of how they are distributing this land. So in like present day Illinois, you have a what they'll call a township, and this township is a little speck on the map here, and it would be made up of a 6 by 6 square mile, and this would be reserved for public schooling. And this area would basically be a town. So think of it kind of like here in Currituck, where we have different townships within the county. That's kind of what they're creating here. So now that we've kind of established how these towns are going to look, now we have to figure out how we're going to govern the towns, and that's what the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is a way to kind of establish governments in the new territories. And one of the first things they do is they say that once you have 5,000 residents, you can create your own self-governing legislature. You can have your own legislative branch, and then you can figure out what you want to do with that. So a territory like, let's say, Indiana or Michigan, they can create their own state legislature, or not state legislatures, but their own legislators branches to create laws for their territories. Once you have 60,000 residents, then you can apply to become a state, and that's what a lot of these things are going, a lot of these territories are going to do. And one of the last parts here is that any new territory, any Northwest ordinance, is outlawed slavery. So slavery is not allowed to be instituted in these new places, restricted just towards the South. By this point, all the northern states had already basically gotten rid of slavery. So the Articles of Confederation actually did set up a good process for how to deal with this newly acquired territory after the Revolutionary War. So even though the system does set up a good way of establishing new states and new territories, there are a lot of weaknesses, and that's what's going to lead to the eventual abolishment of the Articles of Confederation government is the overlying weakness of the federal government. You can imagine that a government that cannot tax is going to lead to problems because there's no funding. You can't operate under having no money. Trade deficits are going to become a huge problem as well because you really don't have the true power to set up trade with other countries. States can block trade as they see fit. And because you have these trade deficits and because you are importing more than you're exporting without being able to collect any sort of revenue, you're spending more than you're earning, which means that they are just in a cyclical form of debt that they cannot get out of, and they cannot pay off their debts from the Revolutionary War. Sounds familiar to today. And I like this chart, and I would definitely write this stuff down because you might see this somewhere on an essay question, whether from me or from the College Board, is that there are certain weaknesses that have certain outcomes. I think of kind of like cause and effect. So a cause or a weakness. Government has no way to collect taxes. They're always short on cash. They're always broke. They're always in debt. They have no power to regulate trade, which creates quarrels. It creates difficulty arranging trade with other countries. It really hurts the country economically. Congress has no power to enforce its laws. They're dependent on the states. There's no executive branch. The legislature makes the laws. They can't enforce them. So what's the point of a law if you can't enforce it? And finally, you need approval of these 9 states to enact laws. Well, it makes it very difficult to enact laws because you need so much contribution from all the states, and you need them to all be on the same page. But they all have different ideas. They all have different economies. They all have different wants and desires. So it makes it very difficult to make anything take place or happen. The idea that you needed an amendment, or an amendment needed all 13, you need a consensus. Think about in class, we try to find a consensus between like 4 people, can't do it. Well, they need 13 states with millions of people, can't. It makes it impossible. The executive branch, there is none. So there's no way to coordinate the government. There's no way to operate. There's no way to make them enforce the laws. And there's no court system. So there's no way to just settle disputes among states. And all of these problems are going to come to a true halt when Shays' Rebellion is going to take place in Massachusetts in 1787. You have a series of farmers in western Massachusetts who are angered by high taxes. They're in debt. They have not been paid from the Revolutionary War. They feel like they've been owed money. And they are going to protest against the government. And the Articles of Confederation has no way to fight back. It's left up to the states, and eventually the states under John Hancock are going to have to put this down, but it shows that the federal government has no power. that it needs more power. So really, the lasting legacy of Shays' Rebellion is that it convinces people that we need a new system of government, and that's where we're going to get to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So you guys make sure you come in with questions, and we will go over Articles of Confederation in class again. Goodbye.